What if faith itself became a crime? Imagine waking up in a world where your prayers are illegal, your sacred traditions are punishable by death, and the very heart of your worship has been taken from you. This was the reality faced by the Jewish people in the 2nd century BC, when a powerful empire decided that belief was a threat that had to be erased. Under the rule of the Seleucid king Antiochus IV, Jewish identity was systematically targeted. Practices that had defined the community for generations, observing the Sabbath, keeping the law, honoring ancestral traditions, were suddenly forbidden. Sacred scrolls were destroyed, rituals were suppressed, and the temple in Jerusalem, the spiritual center of Jewish life, was transformed into something unrecognizable. What had once been holy was now used to enforce conformity. But history does not only belong to empires. It also belongs to those who refuse to forget who they are. The books of the Maccabees tell the story of what happens when faith is pushed to the edge, when survival demands compromise, and conviction demands courage. These ancient texts are not just records of conflict. They are deeply human stories about identity, loyalty, and the cost of standing firm when everything is at stake. Why were these powerful stories left out of many modern Bibles? What truths do they carry that still challenge us today? And why do their messages feel so relevant in a world where belief is often pressured to stay silent? In this video, we are uncovering a chapter of biblical history that few people are ever taught, but everyone should understand. If you are ready to explore these forgotten stories of faith and resilience, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us as we step into the hidden world of the books of the Maccabees. The pressure placed upon the Jewish people did not break their faith all at once. It settled in slowly, quietly, until compromise began to feel unavoidable. Laws changed, customs disappeared, and fear became a daily companion. For many, survival meant silence. But history rarely turns on the choices of the many. It turns on the resolve of the few. In the small town of Modin lived a priest named Mattathias, a man who had spent his life serving within the traditions now being erased. When royal officials arrived to enforce the king's decree, they did not come merely with authority but with expectation. Compliance was presented as practicality, as wisdom, as the cost of peace. All Mattathias had to do was perform a public act that would signal acceptance of the new order. No battlefield stood before him, no army waited behind him. Only a moment, heavy with consequence. What made this moment extraordinary was not its scale, but its clarity. Mattathias understood that once faith is reduced to convenience, it ceases to be faith at all. His refusal was not loud or theatrical. It was deliberate. It carried the weight of generations who had lived and died holding the same covenant. When others stepped forward to conform, hoping to protect themselves from punishment, Mattathias acted in a way that could not be undone. In that instant, obedience to God became open defiance of power. That single choice transformed everything. The quiet tension that had settled over the land finally broke. What had been private fear turned into public resolve. Mattathias fled into the hills with his sons, not as conquerors, but as guardians of a faith that refused to disappear. Others followed, not because they were ordered to, but because they recognized something they had nearly lost: courage rooted in conviction. The revolt that followed was never about ambition or control. It was about identity. Those who joined were not unified by weapons or strategy, but by memory, by the shared knowledge of who they were and what they were being asked to abandon. In this way, the movement grew not through force, but through meaning. Each act of resistance reminded the people that their faith was not owned by kings, decrees, or empires. This is why the story of Mattathias matters so deeply. He did not set out to lead a rebellion. He chose integrity when compromise seemed easier. And that choice revealed a truth that echoes across history. Systems of oppression depend on participation, but they unravel when individuals refuse to take part. Long before armies clashed or victories were won, The Maccabean revolt was already underway. Born in a single moment when one man decided that obedience to conscience mattered more than safety. From that spark, a movement emerged that would reshape Jewish history. Not because one man was powerful, but because his conviction reminded others that they were not powerless. After Mattathias passed from the scene, the fragile movement he had ignited faced a moment of uncertainty. The resistance was scattered, hunted, and vastly outmatched by one of the most powerful military systems of the ancient world. It was in this vulnerable space that leadership passed to his son Judas, a man who did not inherit strength or resources, but responsibility. Known later as Judas Maccabeus, he stepped forward not as a seasoned commander, but as a guardian of the conviction his father had awakened. The world Judas confronted was unforgiving. The Seleucid armies were disciplined, well supplied, and backed by imperial authority. In contrast, the Jewish fighters were farmers, shepherds, and villagers who carried more memory than armor. Their advantage was not tactical brilliance or superior numbers, but clarity of purpose. They were not fighting to expand territory or gain recognition. They were fighting to preserve a way of life that was being erased. That distinction shaped everything that followed. Judas understood that fear was the empire's greatest weapon. If the people could be convinced that resistance was futile, the struggle would end before it truly began. So before each confrontation, he did something unexpected. He reminded his followers of covenant, of stories older than the empire they faced. He spoke of ancestors who had stood at impossible crossroads and trusted that faithfulness mattered even when outcomes were uncertain. In doing, he reframed the conflict. Victory was no longer measured solely by survival, but by obedience. As the battles unfolded, the imbalance remained undeniable. Again and again, Judas led forces that should not have endured, much less prevailed. Yet each encounter seemed to strengthen the resolve of those who followed him. Success did not come through overwhelming force, but through persistence, discipline, and the belief that their struggle was not unseen. The victories were not portrayed as proof of human brilliance, but as moments where courage aligned with trust. These encounters carried a deeper meaning for the people who witnessed them. Every unexpected success reinforced the idea that power is not defined only by weapons or wealth. Empires rise on organization and strength, but they often underestimate the resilience of those who believe their cause is rooted in something greater than survival. Judas did not present himself as a hero above his people. He stood among them, bound by the same risks and the same hope. Over time, the movement gained momentum. Communities that had once remained silent began to believe again, not in invincibility, but in possibility. The victories under Judas Maccabeus did more than reclaim territory. They restored confidence. They reminded a fractured people that faith, when lived out collectively, could challenge even the most intimidating structures of power. What makes this chapter of the story so enduring is not the scale of the battles, but the principle they revealed. Strength alone does not determine outcomes. Loyalty to covenant, shared purpose, and trust beyond immediate circumstances can sustain a people long enough to reshape history. Judas Maccabeus did not defeat an empire through force alone. He exposed its limits by leading a community that refused to believe it had already lost. As the struggle for faith continued, the story of the Maccabees took a quieter yet far more piercing turn. After the clashes of resistance and the unlikely victories that restored hope to a threatened people, 2nd Maccabees invites us into a different kind of battleground, one where no armies march and no strategies are drawn. Yet the cost is immeasurably higher. Here, faith is no longer tested by survival in combat, but by endurance in suffering. The scene shifts away from hills and strongholds to a place of profound human vulnerability. At its center stands a mother and her 7 sons, ordinary in every outward sense, yet extraordinary in conviction. Each son is confronted with the same demand that once confronted Mattathias: abandon the laws that define who you are, or face death. Unlike earlier moments of resistance, there is no possibility of escape, no chance of rallying others, no promise of rescue. The choice offered is stark and personal, stripped of all illusion. But the sons refuse. Their strength does not come from rebellion or defiance, but from certainty. They speak not of hatred toward their persecutors, nor of vengeance, but of trust in a God who sees beyond the present moment. And at the heart of it all stands their mother, bearing witness to each loss without surrendering her faith. Her courage does not silence her grief, but it gives it meaning. She speaks to her sons of life beyond death, of a Creator who can restore what is taken, of a hope that cannot be destroyed by force. This moment marks a profound turning point in Jewish thought. Earlier generations had trusted in God's justice within history, believing that righteousness would be rewarded in this life. But here, in the face of irreversible loss, faith reaches beyond the limits of time. The mother and her sons express a belief that obedience does not end in defeat, that death itself is not the final word. Their confidence in bodily resurrection transforms suffering from tragedy into testimony. What makes this story so powerful is not its drama, but its intimacy. There are no miracles to interrupt the suffering, no sudden reversals to soften the outcome. Instead, the miracle lies in steadfastness. Faith becomes an interior act, unseen by crowds, uncelebrated by history, yet unshakable. This form of devotion would echo through centuries, shaping how later communities understood sacrifice, hope, and justice. The legacy of this moment extends far beyond its immediate context. It provided language for endurance when deliverance did not come quickly, and it offered meaning to those who would later face persecution without the promise of survival. In this way, 2nd Maccabees does not diminish the earlier stories of resistance. It completes them. It shows that faith is not only proven in victory, but also in loss, not only on the battlefield, but in the quiet resolve to remain faithful when everything else is taken away. Through the mother and her 7 sons, the story reminds us that belief in resurrection is not an abstract idea, but a lived conviction, forged in moments where hope must reach beyond what can be seen. As the narrative of the Maccabees unfolds, it becomes increasingly clear that the struggle they faced was never confined to what could be seen. Beyond the clash of armies and the silent endurance of martyrs, these books open a window into a deeper reality, one in which human events are intertwined with a spiritual dimension that remains active and responsive. The victories, losses, and acts of faith described earlier are reframed as part of a much larger conflict, one that extends beyond politics, power, and physical survival. In moments when defeat seemed unavoidable, the text describes signs that suggest the presence of help unseen. Warriors preparing for battle are reminded that they do not stand alone. Visions appear not as spectacles meant to impress, but as assurances meant to strengthen resolve. These encounters do not replace human responsibility. They accompany it, reinforcing the belief that faithfulness invites divine attention, even in the most uncertain circumstances. One of the most striking aspects of these accounts is their restraint. The supernatural does not overwhelm the story or distract from human courage. Instead, it emerges at moments of greatest vulnerability, when exhaustion has set in and hope is fading. Angels are not portrayed as distant symbols, but as active participants who intervene when the balance has tipped too far toward despair. Their presence serves as a reminder that what appears to be a purely human struggle is, in fact, layered with meaning that extends beyond immediate outcomes. Visions, too, play a crucial role in shaping the inner lives of those who lead and follow. These moments do not offer detailed instructions or guarantees of comfort. They offer clarity, a vision of encouragement before battle, or a symbolic gift that represents divine approval, functions as a turning point in perception. Fear gives way to purpose, and uncertainty is replaced with confidence rooted not in strength, but in trust. The leaders of the resistance move forward not because the danger has vanished, but because they believe their cause is seen and supported. What binds these moments together is the idea that spiritual reality does not exist apart from daily life. It moves within it, responding to acts of faith and perseverance. The supernatural signs described in the Maccabean books echo earlier biblical traditions, where unseen forces shape visible events. They also prepare the ground for later theological reflections that view history as more than a sequence of human decisions, but as a space where moral choices carry lasting spiritual weight. These accounts challenge a narrow understanding of conflict. The battles fought by the Maccabees were not only about territory or control. They were about allegiance. Every vision and sign reinforces the idea that faithfulness aligns individuals with a reality greater than any empire. Even when outcomes remain uncertain, the presence of divine support affirms that courage rooted in conviction is never isolated. By weaving supernatural elements into the fabric of the story, the books of the Maccabees invite readers to see resistance, suffering, and hope through a wider lens. They suggest that when people stand for what they believe is right, their actions resonate beyond what can be measured or recorded. The visible struggle may end in victory or loss, but the unseen dimension ensures that faith, once expressed, is never insignificant. As the story reaches its final chapter, 3rd Maccabees brings the journey to an unexpected but deeply meaningful conclusion. After accounts of resistance, courage, suffering, and supernatural support, the focus shifts away from battlefields and weapons altogether. Here, deliverance comes not through strength, strategy, or revolt, but through prayer, fasting, and unwavering trust. This final movement completes the message woven throughout the Maccabean story. Faith is not passive, but its power does not always look the same. The Jewish community in Egypt faced a threat they could not confront with force. There was no army to gather, no terrain to defend, and no opportunity to resist openly. Their situation was defined by vulnerability and isolation. Yet rather than surrender to despair, they turned inward and upward. Through collective prayer and fasting, they chose dependence over fear. This response stands as a quiet but powerful declaration that faith does not require control in order to be effective. Sometimes, its greatest strength is revealed when human options disappear. The deliverance that follows is striking precisely because it defies expectation. Without a single weapon raised, the danger dissolves. What had been carefully planned to bring destruction is undone, not by human intervention, but by a sudden reversal that leaves even those in power forced to acknowledge something beyond their authority. The message is unmistakable. Systems built on fear and coercion are fragile when confronted by steadfast faith. This is where the books of the Maccabees become challenging, even uncomfortable. They refuse to present belief as private or neutral. They insist that faith demands response, whether through resistance, endurance, or prayer. These texts portray devotion as active, costly, and deeply transformative. For later generations shaping biblical canon, this may have raised difficult questions. The Maccabean books do not fit neatly into categories of law, prophecy, or poetry. They confront readers with faith that disrupts political power and reshapes identity, making them harder to contain within simplified theological boundaries. Yet their exclusion from many biblical canons does not diminish their significance. On the contrary, it highlights why they continue to resonate. The stories remind us that faith has always existed in tension with power, that trust in God often places individuals and communities at odds with the world around them. 3rd Maccabees leaves us with a final image not of conquest, but of preservation of a people sustained not by strength, but by belief. As we step away from these ancient texts, the questions they raise remain alive. What does faith look like when action is required? How do we respond when circumstances leave us no control? And do we believe that prayer still matters when outcomes seem decided? Thank you for taking this journey through the books of the Maccabees with us. If this story has deepened your understanding or challenged the way you see faith and history, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue exploring the stories that shape belief, identity, and courage across generations.